Thank you very much, Tom. It's good to be part of the closing party here at the Congress this week. If you don't want to listen to what I'm going to say, I'm going to set you a challenge here. And having looked at this screen for the last 4 days, I've noticed there are 2 animals in the photo there. Vertebrate animals, not tiny little inverts somewhere. So we can all see the walrus. You've got 10 minutes to find the other one. So, in the last 4 days, we've had 55 thematic sessions. We've had various plenaries. We've had dialogues, panels. We've had excursions, posters, poetry, music, film, photographs, ministerial sessions, youth sessions, science sessions, Indigenous peoples discussions and meetings, and a myriad of opportunities for networking amongst the 450 or so people who've been here, not now, but during the entire Congress over the course of the week. So what have we learned and what have we accomplished from this week here in Rovaniemi? Well, you'll all have your own highlights you're taking away from the meeting, but I'm going to just reflect on a few things I've picked up from the meeting here, the Congress here, during this week. Some of which have emerged during the week, and many of which have been strengthened during the week, building on previous discussions and initiatives. It's been tremendous, from my perspective, to see how biodiversity has been discussed during the Congress. And we've had quite a broad approach to this. So we've considered populations. At the species level, we've had a lot of sessions. Habitats, ecosystem services. We've looked at the various threats to biodiversity, from pollution, climate change, infrastructure and wider land use issues, from harvesting, overharvesting, and invasive alien species. And we've looked at the mutually reinforcing agendas for conservation and sustainable use, and the coexistence of people and nature. So we've taken a broad approach to biodiversity in our discussions during the week. And yet we've not been caught up with semantics. And this is particularly impressive given that so many people here are talking in English as a second, third, and even fourth language. But we've not been caught up by semantics, and yet we've recognized the importance of better communications for the work we're doing, for the concept of biodiversity, for the range of issues we've been discussing here during the week. And of course, we've been joined through the week as well by the BBC Natural History Unit, the powerhouse of communications, with an opportunity to support us in inspiring the world to care more about the Arctic. And I hope many of you have had a chance to talk with them about your work during the week. Ministers this morning heard about the last game that's being planned for April next year, which is going to be a hockey event, ice hockey event being planned in the Arctic with prominent sports personalities from around the world, to leverage the convening power of sports diplomacy to raise awareness and highlight the plight of the Arctic in a changing climate. And we need ongoing strong communications from this Congress, from all of the work we've heard about during this week, to take forward this strong message of the relevance and importance of the Arctic. We've recognized during the week that the only constant in the Arctic is change. And we've seen new information on the various Arctic megatrends underway here in the region, on climate, on demographic and social changes, on infrastructural development and change, and on changes to the Arctic cryosphere. We've seen new data emerging during the week, and new ways of looking at data during the week. New monitoring systems and strengthened monitoring systems. We've had new information on protected areas coverage in the Arctic presented during the week. And new and improved data systems for bringing that data together, aggregating it, and providing input to decision-making mechanisms, both here in the Arctic and around the world. There's an ongoing need to focus on harmonization, interoperability, lots of technical challenges there too, and we need to continue to work and address those. And we need to particularly focus on how we can open up access and sharing of data within and beyond the Arctic community. And some of the seeds for that were germinated today in a session with the private sector, talking particularly around private sector data holdings and how they can be more available to the scientific and wider community in the Arctic. Building on the initial encouragement we had from Tom at the start of the Congress, we've had a lot of focus on solutions for the challenges faced by the Arctic. Many solutions in relation to partnerships within and beyond the Arctic. Knowledge sharing, success stories that can be replicated and scaled up, new approaches to financing, and to underpinning decisions with sound knowledge emerging through the work here in the Arctic. And a recognition, by and large, that although there are gaps in our knowledge in the Arctic, we have sufficient information to take more and better decisions. And we need to respond to future impacts now. In our discussions on the Arctic, we've also spoken a lot about some global initiatives and frameworks. We've had good representation from the various international organizations here, many of which have acronyms. CBD, CMS, NAMCO, GBIF, and others. RAMSAR, not an acronym. But we've had good representation for the international bodies here focused on the Arctic too. There's a lot of interest in how the international community can support the work in the Arctic. And of course, we've had growing recognition of the relevance and value of the Arctic in these global discourses. The importance of the Arctic for the global carbon cycle. And we've heard, many of you knew this already, how the Arctic is the most important region of the planet in terms of coverage of wetlands. And we've had strengthened recognition during this week of the Arctic being a part of this global system. It's been great to see a number of turns. WWF, I think, have a program, the Global Arctic Program. It's not the Arctic Program, it's the Global Arctic Program. And many areas in recognition of how the global and the Arctic need to come together and work more closely together. The Arctic Migratory Birds Initiative is a great example, of course, within CAFF, which recognizes that virtually every nation in the world is visited by Arctic migratory breeding birds. And although AMBI sits at the only Arctic Council initiative uniting Arctic Council members, observers, and third countries, it is nonetheless a model that could be thought about for other areas of the work within CAFF too, possibly invasive alien species and others. Again, more thought needs to be given to that going forwards. Beyond the global connections, the lessons learned and the context that's provided to this Congress, we've also recognized the critical importance of engaging at the very local level as well, the importance of local solutions. And we recognize that no communities in the Arctic are the same. No species, no population dynamic is the same across the Arctic. We've heard stories around information around how various populations of caribou are responding differently to changes in the climate, marine mammals responding differently in different parts of the Arctic, seabirds likewise. And so there's no blanket approaches to addressing the challenges faced by the Arctic, and we need to recognize the diversity within the Arctic too and how we take that forward in our discussions. And the diversity of considerations in the Arctic has been matched by the diversity of actors, both involved in the discussions here this week and that need to be involved in the solutions to the challenges faced by the Arctic. We brought together the science, the policy, and the practice of Arctic biodiversity conservation, Indigenous peoples, the private sector, which has had a much stronger representation here than at the first Congress 4 years ago, although remains limited to the extractives and some private sector finance engagement as well. We need to engage beyond this in the future: shipping, fisheries, infrastructure, tourism. We've had national and local governments here involved in our Congress discussions. Strong civil society presence. I've mentioned already the strong intergovernmental presence here at the Congress. The scientific community, ministers, and a head of state, of course, opening up the Congress to start with. But if we're going to have impact, we need to recognize that we need to move beyond science in CAFF. With many diverse participants, we need to strengthen the voices as well so that we can move beyond science and strengthen the governance considerations, management, policy, law, and interdisciplinary approaches to solutions in the Arctic. And we need to all collectively work more towards these wider approaches. And as we look to the future for the global biodiversity agenda, it's going to be essential to have a strong Arctic voice in the discussions of the Convention on Biodiversity coming up towards 2020 and the conferences in Egypt and Beijing. At the UN Environment Assembly next year, which will focus government's attention on innovative solutions to sustainable consumption and production and environmental challenges. At the UN General Assembly, at the Blue Economy conferences, at the negotiations on a legally binding treaty instrument on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, etc., etc., etc. We need to make sure the Arctic voice is strong and coherent in those various discussions. For example, on the post-2020 biodiversity agenda, we need to ensure there is a common approach in raising Arctic issues in relation to the future ambitions on biodiversity. And this can be achieved by Arctic states working together with support from other constituents in the Arctic to build on current ambition in the national biodiversity strategies and action plans, and to raise the bar on those before we get to Beijing, to demonstrate leadership and progress in the Arctic. That will require some focus, and a number of issues we've discussed during this week could be a part of that focus and consideration. Restoration, wetlands, sustainable use, pollution, addressing invasive alien species. It's a number of areas where the Arctic could focus effort and attention in engaging with the global community. And all of this focused on solutions to addressing the drivers of biodiversity loss. The big 5 drivers of biodiversity loss in relation to climate change, invasive species, overexploitation, pollution, and habitat loss, land use changes. But I would caution against simplified area-based targets as we go forward. We've had a strong campaign presence here from colleagues outside, around 30% of the oceans being protected. It's really important where it's protected in terms of priority areas. It's really important how sites and biodiversity is represented in those sort of future targets. So with all of this insight from the Congress, we now need to put this into practice in the Arctic. And we need to recognize that the science and indigenous knowledge will underpin solutions, but science alone will not solve the problems. It's awareness, it's capacity, it's motivation, it's political will for action that's needed from all actors to secure the future of the Arctic people and the environment. And so what was the single most important thing I've taken from this week for the future of the Arctic? Well, I'm going to be honest. Amongst all of the fabulous science, the knowledge, the experience, the practice, solutions, suggestions here in Rovaniemi, I suggest that the most important news for the Arctic this week came from 4,100 miles away in South Korea, with a very clear message from the release of the IPCC special report, with a stark message and very simple message, which is we have 12 years to reduce our emissions by 50% if we are to avoid the most dangerous impacts of climate change and keep within the 1.5 degree global average. Of course, that's much higher in the Arctic. And despite what we've heard this week from some of the presenters around we need to go slow, considerate, don't rush into things, this is such an important, compelling and urgent message. Nowhere else in the world will be subject to greater temperature changes than here in the Arctic. And so it's imperative for the Arctic that each and every one of us take collective and individual action to address climate change through purse, power, and politics. The Arctic must show leadership on climate change. And as we leave from this week, let me finish with one question we must ask ourselves. What will we do, individually and collectively, in our personal and institutional lives to reduce carbon emissions by 50% within the next 12 years? So that when we meet again at a future Arctic Biodiversity Congress, we can say we have put our knowledge into action for the people and environment in the Arctic. Thank you very much. Before I leave you and pass you back to Tom, just 2 very quick things. The first one was, for those of you who weren't paying attention and were scouring this screen here to find the other animal, it's a bird, and it's hiding here in the word biodiversity. And you can see here between the R and the S very clearly the duck's head. The rest of the body is hiding there. It's even got an eye based on the photo. Okay, one last thing before I leave as well, and because they will thank everybody else except themselves, it gives me great pleasure to, on behalf of all of us, pass a huge vote of thanks to the Congress co-chairs, to Cynthia, who's currently with the ministerial meeting, to Auliki and to Tom, for your leadership, your drive, your inspiration, and for pulling off a truly tremendous CAFF Arctic Biodiversity Congress. Thank you very much.